My name is Ibrahim Traoré, and I am a man like you, born under the golden sun of Burkina Faso, raised on the red earth that connects us all to our ancestors, shaped by the same hopes and dreams that beat in every human heart. Today, I want to share with you a story that changed not just my understanding of the world, but perhaps the world's understanding of what it means to treat each other with dignity. This is not a story about power or politics. It is not about titles or ceremonies. It is about something far more fundamental, about respect, about humanity, about the invisible threads that connect us all regardless of the color of our skin, the weight of our wallets, or the seats we occupy on life's journey. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in March, on Flight 227 from Paris to Ouagadougou, in Seat 2A of the first-class cabin. But the real story began long before I stepped onto that plane, and its echoes continue to this day, rippling across continents and touching hearts in ways I never could have imagined. The morning had started like any other in Paris. I woke before dawn in a modest hotel room near Charles de Gaulle Airport. No presidential suite, no entourage waiting in the lobby, no flags or fanfare. Just a simple room with white walls, a small bed, and a window that looked out onto the bustling life of the city. I had chosen to travel this way deliberately, not as a president, but as a citizen of the world. I dressed carefully that morning, selecting clothes that spoke of simplicity rather than status. A plain black shirt, well-pressed but unremarkable. Dark trousers that had seen many wears but were kept clean and dignified. Simple leather shoes, polished to a quiet shine, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that shows self-respect. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw not a head of state, but a man preparing for a journey home. My luggage was modest, a single small bag containing the essentials, a change of clothes, a worn copy of Thomas Sankora's speeches, a notebook filled with observations about governance and humanity, and a small cloth bearing the colors of Burkina Faso. Not the ceremonial flag of office, but a simple piece of fabric that my grandmother had sewn for me years ago, telling me, "Carry your country in your heart, not on your chest." The taxi ride to the airport was unremarkable. The driver, a man from Algeria with tired eyes and calloused hands, spoke little French but smiled when I greeted him in Arabic. We drove through the morning traffic, past cafes opening their doors, past workers hurrying to catch trains, past the ordinary miracle of a city awakening. I tipped him well and thanked him in his native tongue. His smile grew wider, and for a moment, we were just two men from Africa, far from home, but connected by something deeper than borders. Charles de Gaulle Airport was a symphony of controlled chaos. Thousands of people moved through its corridors. Like rivers flowing to the sea, businessmen checking phones, families juggling luggage and crying children, tourists clutching guidebooks and dreams. The air hummed with announcements in multiple languages, the click of suitcase wheels on polished floors, the distant rumble of aircraft engines. I made my way to the check-in counter, my boarding pass already printed from an online check-in. First class, seat 2A, window side. I had paid for it with my own money, not state funds, not diplomatic privileges, but the savings of a man who occasionally allowed himself a small comfort for a long journey home. The check-in process was smooth, professional. The agent, a young woman with kind eyes, processed my documents without a second glance. She smiled as she handed me my boarding pass, wished me a pleasant flight, and moved on to the next passenger. No drama, no questions, just human courtesy doing its quiet work. But the real test began when I entered the first-class lounge. The Air France salon was a sanctuary of muted luxury. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs arranged in intimate clusters, the gentle clink of glasses and subdued conversations, creating an atmosphere of refined calm. Business executives sat with laptops open, their fingers dancing across keyboards as they managed empires from leather armchairs. Diplomats spoke in hushed tones into phones, negotiating futures in multiple languages. Wealthy tourists planned itineraries while sipping champagne that cost more than many people earned in a day. And then there was me. I found a quiet corner near a large window overlooking the tarmac, where planes moved like gentle giants in an ancient dance of arrival and departure. I sat down, placed my small bag at my feet, and pulled out my notebook. I began to write, not state secrets or policy documents, but observations about the people around me, reflections on leadership, thoughts about the nature of power and humility. The stares began almost immediately. A woman in an expensive suit glanced at me over her newspaper, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in my simple clothes. A businessman at the bar turned to whisper something to his companion, both of them looking in my direction with poorly concealed curiosity. A couple near the magazines exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their assumptions. I had seen these looks before, in meetings with foreign dignitaries who couldn't quite believe that this quiet man in simple clothes could be a head of state. I had felt the weight of these assumptions in international forums where my worth was measured not by my words, but by my appearance, my accent, the continent of my birth. But I had learned long ago that dignity is not something that can be taken from you. It can only be given away. So I sat quietly, wrote in my notebook, and waited for my flight. An elderly French gentleman, distinguished in the way that money and privilege can make a man appear, approached the hostess at the reception desk. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw him gesture in my direction, saw the hostess glance over with a slight frown before shaking her head and returning to her work. The man shrugged and walked away, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Another passenger, a woman with pearl earrings and the bearing of old money, spoke loudly enough for others to hear. The standards for this lounge have certainly changed. She didn't look at me directly, but her meaning was clear. Several people nodded in agreement, their comfort with casual prejudice as polished as their shoes. I continued to write. Words about patience, about the strength that comes from understanding that other people's opinions are reflections of their own limitations, not measurements of your worth. About the difference between respect that is earned and respect that is demanded. About the quiet revolution that happens when you refuse to be diminished by small minds and smaller hearts. The boarding call for Flight 227 came at 2:30 p.m., the voice crisp and professional over the lounge speakers. Air France Flight 227 to Ouagadougou is now boarding. We invite our premium passengers to board at Gate 2E. I closed my notebook, gathered my bag, and joined the small queue of first-class passengers making their way to the gate. The whispers followed me like shadows, but I walked with the same steady pace I had learned from watching my grandfather tend his fields, unhurried, purposeful, dignified. At the gate, the real drama was about to begin. The boarding gate was a microcosm of the world, a place where paths crossed, where strangers became temporary companions, where the thin veneer of civilization was tested by stress, fatigue, and the unconscious prejudices that lurk in even the most sophisticated hearts. Behind the desk stood Clara Dubois, a woman in her early 40s with blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had learned to judge before they learned to see. She wore her Air France uniform like armor, each crease pressed to perfection, each button a small declaration of authority. She had worked for the airline for 15 years, long enough to develop strong opinions about who belonged in which cabin, long enough to mistake procedure for wisdom. The queue moved forward smoothly. A businessman in a tailored suit was welcomed aboard with professional warmth. A well-dressed couple was processed with smiles and pleasant small talk about their destination. An elderly woman with a walking stick was offered assistance with genuine concern. And then it was my turn. I stepped forward and extended my boarding pass with a polite nod. "Bonjour," I said simply. Clara's professional smile faltered as she looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. Her eyes moved from my face to my clothes, from my simple bag to my worn but clean shoes. I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes, the assumptions taking shape like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice carrying a note of suspicion that hadn't been there for the previous passengers. "I believe you may be lost. The economy boarding is over there." She gestured toward another gate where a longer line of passengers waited. I maintained my calm expression and held out my boarding pass again. "This is my boarding pass," I said quietly. "Seat 2A. Clara took the pass, her fingers holding it as if it might contaminate her. She studied it with exaggerated care, her face cycling through disbelief, suspicion, and something darker. The seconds stretched into an uncomfortable silence as other passengers behind me began to shift impatiently. "Seat 2A, she read aloud, her voice carrying a tone of disbelief that made nearby passengers look up from their phones and magazines. "This must be some kind of mistake." "There is no mistake," I replied, my voice remaining steady despite the growing attention from other passengers. "I purchased a first-class ticket. That is my seat." Clara's face hardened, and when she looked at me again, I saw something that made my heart heavy, not just suspicion, but active hostility. "Sir, this flight is not for someone of your background. You clearly don't belong in first class. Perhaps you used someone else's credit card? Perhaps you didn't understand what you were booking?" The words hit the air like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the gathered passengers. A young mother with a baby gasped audibly. A businessman in line behind me frowned and pulled out his phone, beginning to record. An elderly couple exchanged worried glances, but I had faced worse storms than this. I had stood before hostile crowds as a young revolutionary. I had negotiated with world leaders who saw me as nothing more than another African upstart. I had weathered coups and conspiracies, economic crises and political upheavals. This woman's prejudice was painful, but it was not powerful enough to break me. "Madame," I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority that comes not from position, but from conviction, "I have purchased this ticket legally. I have committed no crime except perhaps the crime of not matching your expectations of what a first-class passenger should look like. But my ticket is valid, my money was good, and my seat is waiting." A younger airline employee, Marcus, a man with kind eyes and the nervous energy of someone who recognized that the situation was spiraling beyond normal customer service protocols, approached the desk. "Clara, is everything all right here?" Clara turned to him, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that was clearly intended for me to hear. "This man is trying to force his way into first class with what I suspect is a fraudulent ticket. Look at him. Does he look like he can afford first class?" Marcus took my boarding pass and scanned it with his handheld device. The machine beeped softly and displayed a green check mark, the digital confirmation of what should have been obvious from the beginning. "The ticket is valid," Marcus said quietly, glancing nervously between Clara and me. "All the details check out. Mr. He looked at the name on the ticket, but the font was small and he couldn't quite make it out. "The system must be wrong," Clara snapped, her voice rising in pitch as her certainty crumbled. "It doesn't matter what the computer says. Look at him. Do you really think he belongs in seat 2A? Do you think he can afford champagne and caviar? Do you think the other passengers will be comfortable?" I stepped aside momentarily to allow a mother with a crying baby to pass through, then returned to face Clara. The simple act of courtesy seemed to only inflame her further. "I am not here to cause trouble," I said, my voice carrying the patience of someone who had learned that anger often reveals more about the angry person than their target. "I simply want to take the seat I have paid for, complete my journey home, and cause no harm to anyone. If my presence somehow offends you, I apologize. But I will not apologize for existing, and I will not be denied what I have rightfully purchased." The crowd of waiting passengers had grown larger, drawn by the unusual nature of the confrontation. Phones were raised, recording the interaction for social media feeds and group chats. The viral age had arrived at Gate 2E, though none of us knew yet how far this moment would travel. Marcus looked increasingly uncomfortable, caught between his colleague's obvious prejudice and his own sense of what was right. "Clara, maybe we should just— You want to lose your job over this?" Clara cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. "You want to be responsible when the other first-class passengers complain? When corporate asks why we allowed this into the premium cabin?" I sighed deeply, not from frustration, but from the sadness that comes with recognizing that hatred often wears the mask of duty. "I will board now," I said, stepping toward the gate entrance. Clara moved to block my path, her face flushed with the righteousness of someone who believed their prejudice was justified. "Don't say I didn't warn you," she hissed as I passed. "We'll see how long you last in that seat. We'll see how comfortable you feel when you realize you don't belong there." I walked past her and into the jet bridge, my steps steady despite the whispers and phone cameras that followed me. Behind me, I could hear Marcus trying to calm the other passengers, assuring them that everything was fine, that boarding would continue normally. But everything was not fine. Something fundamental had been broken in those moments at the gate. Not just the basic courtesy that should exist between human beings, but the very idea that dignity is a birthright, rather than a privilege to be granted or withheld based on appearance. As I walked down the narrow corridor toward the aircraft, I thought about my grandmother's words from many years ago. "Child, the world will try to make you small. Your job is not to fight the world, but to remain large in your own heart." I was about to need that advice more than I had ever imagined. The first-class cabin of the Air France A330 was a study in understated luxury. 16 seats arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration, each one a small sanctuary of leather and personal space. The lighting was soft and warm, designed to soothe rather than illuminate. The air carried the subtle sense of new leather and expensive cologne, creating an atmosphere of pampered comfort. Seat 2A was by the window on the left side of the aircraft, with a view that would soon show the patchwork of European countryside giving way to the vast expanse of the Mediterranean, then the golden deserts of North Africa, and finally, the green hills of home. I stowed my small bag in the overhead compartment and settled into the seat, which embraced me with the kind of comfort that money could buy, though, as I would soon learn, money could not buy respect. I pulled out my notebook and pen, beginning to write my observations about the morning's events. Not with anger or bitterness, but with the analytical mind of someone who had learned to find lessons in every human interaction, wisdom in every wound. The other passengers settled into their seats around me. In 1A sat François Delacroix, a French CEO in his 50s whose expensive suit and confident bearing spoke of boardroom victories and international success. He had noticed the commotion at the gate, and I could feel his curious glances as he arranged his business papers and laptop. Across the aisle in 2D sat Madame Catherine Rousseau, an elegant woman in her 70s with pearl earrings and the refined posture of old money. She had watched the boarding process with the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to observing social hierarchies, and I sensed both her curiosity about me and her discomfort with Clara's obvious hostility. Behind me, the other first-class passengers settled in, business travelers, tourists, a diplomatic couple returning from a conference in Brussels. The quiet efficiency of wealth and privilege creating its own small ecosystem above the clouds. Clara entered the cabin with the brisk professionalism of someone determined to maintain control of her domain. She moved through the first-class cabin like a general inspecting troops, checking that seat belts were fastened, offering newspapers and drinks, ensuring that every detail met the airline's standards of service. for every passenger except me. She greeted Francois with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Delacroix. So lovely to have you aboard again. Your usual whiskey before takeoff?" To Madame Rousseau. "Bonjour, madame. I trust you had a pleasant stay in Paris? May I bring you some champagne or perhaps our special blend tea?" When she reached my seat, her entire demeanor shifted. The smile disappeared, replaced by a cold professionalism that bordered on hostility. "What do you want to drink?" she asked, her voice flat and unwelcoming. "Water would be fine, please," I replied with the same quiet courtesy I had shown at the gate. "Sparkling or still?" she snapped, as if even this simple choice was an imposition. "Still water, thank you." She returned with a plastic bottle of water, not the crystal glassware offered to other passengers, not the elegant presentation that came with first-class service. She placed it on my tray table with unnecessary force, the bottle nearly tipping over before I caught it. "Thank you," I said, though she was already moving away without acknowledgement. Francois Delacroix had been watching this exchange with growing discomfort. As a CEO, he understood customer service, and what he was witnessing violated every principle of professional hospitality. His brow furrowed as he observed Clara's behavior, and I could see him wrestling with the decision of whether to intervene. The aircraft engines began their deep rumble, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Martin speaking. We are preparing for departure to Ouagadougou with a flight time of approximately 5.5 hours. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your seats are in the upright position." As we taxied toward the runway, Clara made another round through the cabin, offering hot towels to the passengers. Again, she provided this service to everyone except me, walking past my seat as if I were invisible. The slight was so obvious that Madame Rousseau leaned forward and whispered to her companion, "This is absolutely inappropriate. That man has done nothing wrong." The aircraft lifted into the sky, Paris falling away beneath us as we climbed through layers of clouds toward the sun. I looked out the window and thought about journeys, not just this one, but all the journeys that had brought me to this moment. The journey from a small village in Burkina Faso to the halls of power. The journey from a young revolutionary to a seasoned leader. The journey from anger at injustice to understanding that true change comes not from fighting hatred, but from refusing to let it diminish your humanity. Lunch service began an hour into the flight. The meal was an elaborate affair, French cuisine presented with artistic flair on fine china. Clara served each passenger with theatrical attention to detail, describing the dishes and recommending wine pairings. When she reached my seat, she dropped a tray in front of me without ceremony or explanation. "Here," she said curtly. "Hope this meets your standards." The tray contained the same food as the others, but the presentation was careless, sloppy. The salmon was askew on the plate, the sauce had spilled slightly, the accompaniments looked like they had been thrown together without care. It was a small act of sabotage, petty but pointed. "Thank you," I said simply, which seemed to frustrate her further. Francois had seen enough. He raised his hand to get Clara's attention. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone, accustomed to being heard. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Clara approached his seat with the deferential smile she reserved for important passengers. "Of course, Mr. Delacroix. How may I help you?" "I've been watching your service during this flight," Francois said, quietly, "and I have to ask, why are you treating that gentleman with such obvious disrespect?" Clara's face reddened. "Sir, I don't know what you mean. I'm providing standard service to all passengers." "No," Francois said firmly. "You're not. You've been rude to him from the moment we boarded. You've ignored his basic needs, served him differently from the rest of us, and created an atmosphere of hostility that reflects poorly on this airline and, frankly, on all of us as human beings." Other passengers began to pay attention to the conversation. The diplomatic couple stopped their quiet discussion. Madame Rousseau set down her wine glass and leaned forward to listen. "Sir, please mind your own business," Clara said, but her voice carried less conviction now, the authority draining from her words as she realized she was losing control of the narrative. "This is my business," Francois replied. "I'm a paying passenger who expects to travel in a civilized environment. What I'm witnessing is neither civilized nor professional. That man has been nothing but courteous, and you've treated him like a criminal." "Why?" The cabin grew quiet except for the steady hum of the engines. Several passengers were now openly recording the confrontation, understanding that they were witnessing something significant. Clara looked around the cabin, seeing for the first time that her behavior had been observed and judged by others. The comfort of thinking her prejudice was shared evaporated as she met disapproving stares from her other passengers. I was just ensuring that all passengers are properly accommodated," she stammered. "By providing inferior service to one passenger based on what criteria exactly?" Francois pressed. "His appearance? His accent? The color of his skin?" Clara turned and walked quickly toward the galley, her face burning with embarrassment and anger. I could hear her muttering to Marcus, who had been serving the economy cabin, "How dare they defend him? Who does he think he is? This is my cabin, my rules." Marcus tried to calm her down, but Clara was beyond reason now, trapped between her prejudice and the growing awareness that her actions were being scrutinized and recorded. In seat 2A, I continued to eat my meal with the same quiet dignity I had maintained throughout the flight. I thought about my father's words from long ago. "Son, the measure of a man is not how he treats those who can help him, but how he treats those who can do nothing for him." Clara had failed that test, but more importantly, she had revealed something about herself that would soon become visible to the entire world. I reached into my pocket and touched the small piece of cloth bearing the colors of Burkina Faso. Not yet. The moment of revelation had not yet come. The flight continued over the Mediterranean, carrying with it a lesson about humanity that none of us yet fully understood. As the aircraft began its descent toward Ouagadougou, Clara made one final round through the first-class cabin. The setting sun painted the clouds in shades of gold and amber, and below us, the familiar landscape of West Africa spread like a vast tapestry of red earth and green vegetation. She stopped at my seat one last time, her face set in lines of cold determination. "I hope next time you choose the right cabin," she said in a low voice. "You were lucky we didn't remove you before takeoff." I looked up from my notebook, meeting her eyes with the calm gaze of someone who had learned long ago that other people's hatred says more about them than about you. "Sometimes," I said quietly, "the seat we choose is not about money or comfort. It is about what we represent. It is about the changes that must come to this world, one flight at a time." My words seemed to hit her with unexpected force. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, as if something in my tone had finally penetrated her certainty. But it was too late for understanding now. Too much had been said. Too much had been revealed. As she walked away, Clara leaned close to my ear and whispered words that would haunt her for years to come. "You smell like someone who hasn't bathed in a month. You think sitting in first class makes you clean, but it doesn't. It just makes this whole cabin stink." The words were meant to wound, to diminish, to put me in my place. But they had the opposite effect. Madame Rousseau, sitting close enough to hear, gasped audibly and turned to face Clara with undisguised disgust. "That is quite enough," she said firmly. "You have gone far beyond the boundaries of professional behavior. You should be ashamed of yourself." Francois stood up, his patience finally exhausted. "Clara, you have embarrassed yourself, this airline, and every passenger on this flight. That man has shown more grace and dignity than you could understand. You may not know who he is, But I can tell he is a person of substance and character. Clara's face cycled through emotions, anger, defiance, and finally the first hint of uncertainty. I was just doing my job, she said weakly. No, Francois said sharply. You were indulging your prejudices. There's a difference. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach to Ouagadougou. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your seatbacks are in the upright position. Local time is 6:45 p.m. and the temperature is 32 degrees Celsius. As the aircraft descended through the evening sky, something unusual was happening on the ground. Through the small cabin windows, passengers began to notice that the airport below looked different from a typical arrival. There were more vehicles than usual around the terminal, more activity on the tarmac. Is there some kind of event at the airport? Someone asked. Clara looked out the window, puzzled. She hadn't received any notifications about VIP passengers or special arrivals. According to her passenger manifest, this was a routine flight with business travelers and tourists. Marcus approached her with his phone in hand, his face pale. Clara, you need to see this, he said urgently. She took the phone and looked at the screen. Her hands began to tremble as she saw what he was showing her, a news article with a photograph that made her world tilt on its axis. The image showed me, but not as she had seen me on this flight. In the photo, I wore a military uniform decorated with the insignia of office. I stood before a crowd of thousands, the flag of Burkina Faso billowing behind me. Soldiers saluted, ministers bowed. The headline read, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso addresses the nation. This can't be right, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. Marcus nodded grimly. I did some research during the flight. That passenger in 2A isn't just anyone. He's the president of Burkina Faso, the man you've been insulting for the past 5 hours as a head of state. Clara sank into an empty seat, the phone falling from nerveless fingers. Around the cabin, other passengers were beginning to figure out what was happening as they used their own phones to search for information about their mysterious fellow passenger. Outside the aircraft windows, the unusual activity at the airport was becoming clearer. A red carpet had been rolled out on the tarmac. A convoy of black vehicles with official license plates waited in formation. Soldiers in dress uniforms stood at attention. The media had arrived, cameras, reporters, the full apparatus of state ceremony. I continued to sit quietly in seat 2A, writing in my notebook as if nothing unusual was happening. But I could feel the shift in the cabin's atmosphere, the whispers and glances, the growing awareness that this ordinary flight had become something extraordinary. The aircraft touched, down smoothly, the wheels kissing the tarmac of Thomas Sankara International Airport with barely a bump. As we taxied toward the gate, passengers pressed their faces to windows, trying to understand the scene unfolding outside. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ouagadougou, the captain announced. Please remain seated until the aircraft comes to. A complete stop and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. But the aircraft didn't go to a regular gate. Instead, it was directed to a special area of the tarmac where the red carpet waited, where the soldiers stood in formation, where the weight of ceremony and protocol created an atmosphere of undeniable significance. Clara sat frozen in her seat, the magnitude of her behavior finally hitting her with full force. She had not just been rude to a passenger, she had insulted a head of state, created an international incident, and recorded it all for posterity thanks to the phones that had captured every moment. Marcus placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. The captain wants to see you as soon as we're parked, he said quietly. There's going to be an investigation. There are going to be consequences. As the engines wound down and the aircraft came to its final stop, I closed my notebook and prepared to disembark, not as the anonymous passenger who had boarded in Paris, but as the president of Burkina Faso returning home from a journey that had taught him and the world something profound about dignity, prejudice, and the thin line between civilization and cruelty. The door opened, and warm African air flowed into the cabin, carrying with it the sense of home, red dust and green plants, cooking fires, and hope. I stood and retrieved my simple bag from the overhead compartment, the same bag that had seemed so out of place to Clara just hours earlier. As I walked toward the exit, Francois stood and extended his hand. "Mr. President," he said respectfully, "please accept my apologies for what you endured on this flight. You carried yourself with remarkable dignity." I shook his hand warmly. "Thank you for your support. Sometimes we must walk among people as they truly are, to understand who they truly are." Madame Rousseau also stood, tears in her eyes. "Your grace in the face of such treatment was inspiring, Mr. President. I am ashamed that it happened, but grateful that I witnessed how a true leader responds to injustice." I nodded to her with respect. "Madame, your voice of conscience was appreciated. Evil thrives when good people remain silent." And then I walked to the door of the aircraft, where Clara sat slumped in her seat, her career in ruins, her worldview shattered, her actions about to echo around the globe. I stopped and looked down at her. She raised her eyes to meet mine, and I saw in them not defiance now, but the terrible awareness of someone who has finally understood the magnitude of their mistake. "Would it have made a difference?" I asked quietly. "If you had known who I was?" She tried to speak, but no words came. "That," I said gently, "is the question you must answer for yourself." Then I stepped out of the aircraft and onto the red carpet, where the cameras flashed and the soldiers saluted, where the full ceremony of state waited to welcome home a president who had learned, once again, that true power lies not in commanding respect, but in maintaining dignity when respect is denied. Behind me, in the cabin of Flight 227, Clara buried her face in her hands and began to weep, not just for her ruined career, but for the person she had revealed herself to be. The footage began appearing on social media before I had even finished my official arrival ceremony. Passengers had recorded Clara's behavior, the confrontations, my quiet responses, and the dramatic revelation of my identity. Within hours, the hashtag DrSeat2A was trending worldwide, and the story was being shared across every platform, translated into dozens of languages, sparking conversations in living rooms and boardrooms from Paris to Beijing. The initial reactions were swift and decisive. Air France issued an immediate statement. "We deeply regret the unacceptable behavior displayed by our employee toward President Traoré. This conduct violates our core values of respect and dignity for all passengers. A full investigation is underway, and appropriate disciplinary action will be taken." Clara Dubois was suspended pending investigation. The airline's customer service departments were flooded with complaints, praise for my restraint, and demands for accountability. Stock prices fluctuated as investors weighed the potential impact of the public relations disaster. But the story had transcended corporate consequences. It had touched something deeper in the global consciousness, a recognition that what happened in that first-class cabin was a microcosm of larger struggles with racism, dignity, and human worth that societies around the world continued to grapple with. That evening, I held a press conference in the garden of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou. The international media had descended on our capital, their cameras and microphones creating a forest of attention around the podium where I stood. I wore my military uniform now, the flag of Burkina Faso on my chest. But my message was not about military might or political power. "Today I boarded an aircraft as an ordinary passenger," I began, my voice carrying across the gathered crowd and through the cameras to millions of people around the world. "I did not announce my title. I did not demand special treatment. I did not expect anything more than basic human courtesy. But what I received was something else entirely. I received hatred disguised as policy. I received disrespect wrapped in the language of standards. I received treatment that no human being should endure, regardless of their position or the color of their skin. This was not just an insult to me as a president. It was an insult to every person who has ever been judged by their appearance rather than their character. It was an insult to every African who has been told they don't belong. It was an insult to every human being who has been made to feel small by someone else's prejudice. I paused, looking directly into the cameras, knowing that my words were traveling instantly across continents and cultures. But I want the world to understand something important. I do not tell this story to seek pity or to demand apologies. I tell it because it reveals a truth that we must all confront. Hatred still lives in too many hearts. Prejudice still poisons too many minds. And until we acknowledge this reality, we cannot begin to change it. I forgive Clara Dubois, I continued, and the crowd gasped. Yes, I forgive her, not because what she did was acceptable, but because forgiveness is not a gift we give to others. It is a gift we give to ourselves. It frees us from the poison of hatred and allows us to focus on the real work, building a world where such treatment becomes unthinkable. Clara Dubois is not evil. She is human, flawed, and shaped by the same prejudices that infect our societies. Her actions were a mirror, showing us what we must change, not just in airlines or hotels or offices, but in our hearts and minds. Stepped closer to the microphones, my voice growing stronger. True power is not in the ability to destroy those who wrong us. True power is in the ability to transform wrong into right, hatred into understanding, division into unity. If my experience on that flight helps one person examine their own prejudices, if it sparks one conversation about dignity and respect, if it prevents one other human being from being treated as I was treated, then something beautiful will have emerged from something ugly. The questions from journalists came in multiple languages, from reporters representing media outlets across 6 continents. They wanted to know about diplomatic consequences, about lawsuits, about whether this would affect Burkina Faso's relationships with France and other nations. But I redirected each question back to the human dimension of the story. This is not about nations, I explained. This is about individuals. It is about the choice each person makes when they encounter someone different from themselves. Do they see an enemy or a fellow human being? Do they see a threat or an opportunity to learn? Do they see someone to diminish or someone to respect? While I was speaking to the world's media, Clara Dubois sat in her small apartment in the suburbs of Paris, her phone buzzing incessantly with calls from reporters, friends, family members, and strangers who had found her contact information online. She had turned off her television after watching the first few news reports, unable to bear seeing her behavior dissected and analyzed by commentators around the world. Her mother called from Lyon, her voice a mixture of disappointment and concern. Clara, how could you behave this way? This is not how I raised you. This is not who you are. But Clara was beginning to wonder if perhaps this was exactly who she was, if the ugly words and actions on the flight had revealed something about herself that she had hidden even from her own consciousness. She had worked for Air France for 15 years, priding herself on her professionalism and attention to detail. She had served passengers from every continent, every background, every economic level. But now, forced to examine her behavior honestly, she realized that her professionalism had often been selective. She had been warmer to some passengers than others. She had made assumptions about who deserved first-class treatment and who didn't. She had carried unconscious biases that had shaped her interactions in ways she was only now beginning to understand. The video footage played endlessly, on social media and news channels, showing her behavior in stark, unflattering clarity. She watched herself refuse service, drop food carelessly, whisper insults, and treat a fellow human being with contempt. The woman in those videos seemed like a stranger, yet Clara couldn't deny that it was her. Her voice, her actions, her choices, her phone buzzed with a text from her colleague, Marcus. The airline fired you an hour ago. I'm sorry, Clara. I tried to speak up for you, but after the president's speech, there was no choice. She set the phone aside and walked to her bathroom mirror, staring at her own reflection. "Who are you?" she asked aloud. "What have you become?" The answer came not in words, but in a flood of memories, comments she had made about passengers when she thought no one was listening, assumptions she had made based on clothing, accent, skin color, small acts of preference and prejudice that had seemed insignificant at the time but now formed a pattern she could no longer deny. She thought about President Traoré's calm dignity in the face of her hostility, his refusal to respond with anger, his grace under pressure, his words about forgiveness that she had watched in news coverage of his press conference. That night, Clara sat at her kitchen table and began to write. Not a public statement or an excuse, but a letter, handwritten, personal, honest. "Dear President Traoré," she began, her pen trembling slightly, "I am the woman who treated you with such disrespect on Flight 227. I am writing not because I expect forgiveness or because I want to repair my reputation, but because I need to acknowledge what I have done and what it reveals about me. You were right to ask whether it would have made a difference if I had known who you were. The honest answer is yes, it would have made a difference, and that is exactly the problem. I should not need to know someone's title or position to treat them with basic human dignity. The fact that I do reveals how deeply poisoned my thinking has become. I grew up believing I was not racist. I had friends of different backgrounds. I traveled to different countries. I thought prejudice was something that belonged to other people, older people, less educated people. But watching myself on those videos, I saw the truth I had hidden from myself. I am prejudiced. I carry biases that I never examined. I make assumptions that I never questioned. I insulted you not because of anything you did, but because of who you are, because your appearance didn't match my narrow ideas of who belongs in first class. I made judgments about your worth based on your clothing, your skin color, your quiet demeanor. I treated you as less than human, and in doing so, I revealed how little humanity I carried in my own heart. I know my apology cannot undo the harm I caused. I know my words cannot erase the pain I inflicted. But I want you to know that your response, your dignity, your grace, your forgiveness, has forced me to confront truths about myself that I had avoided for too long. I am losing my job, my reputation, my sense of who I thought I was. But perhaps that is what needed to happen. Perhaps I needed to be broken down before I could be built back up into someone better. I don't know if you will ever read this letter. I don't know if you would care about the thoughts of someone who treated you so poorly. But I needed to write it, if only to begin the long process of becoming the person I should have been all along. With deep regret and newfound understanding, Clara Dubois. She sealed the letter and placed it on her table, not yet sure if she would send it. Outside her window, Paris hummed with its usual energy, but Clara's world had fundamentally shifted. She was no longer the same person who had boarded Flight 227 that morning. The story of Flight 227 continued to spread, touching lives in ways that none of us could have anticipated. In schools across Africa, teachers used it as a lesson about dignity and respect. In corporate boardrooms in Europe and America, executives examined their own policies and training programs. In homes around the world, families had conversations about prejudice, privilege, and the treatment of others. Dr. Amara Sese, a professor of sociology at the University of Ghana, assigned the incident as a case study for her students. "This story," she told her class, "illustrates how individual acts of discrimination are connected to larger systems of oppression. When that flight attendant treated President Traoré poorly, she wasn't just being personally rude. She was enacting centuries of colonial attitudes about who has value and who doesn't." One of her students, a young woman named Fatou, raised her hand. "But, Professor, what about the president's response? He could have revealed his identity immediately. He could have had her fired on the spot. Why didn't he use his power? Dr. Sese smiled. That's exactly the point, Fatu. True power isn't about dominating others. It's about maintaining your dignity regardless of how others treat you. President Traoré understood that revealing his identity too early would have made this about hierarchy and position. By enduring the treatment as an ordinary passenger, he made it about something much more fundamental: how we treat each other as human beings. In France, the story sparked a national conversation about racism in customer service industries. The French Minister of Transport announced new training programs for airline staff. Anti-discrimination organizations organized workshops and seminars. The incident became a catalyst for examining prejudices that many French citizens had preferred not to acknowledge. Jean-Luc Martineau, a taxi driver in Marseille, found himself thinking about the story as he picked up passengers. How many times had he made assumptions about people based on their appearance? How many opportunities for connection had he missed because of his own biases? When he picked up a young African man outside the train station that week, instead of his usual silent efficiency, he found himself starting a conversation. "Where are you from originally?" he asked, not with suspicion, but with genuine curiosity. "Senegal," the young man replied, clearly surprised by the friendly tone. "I've never been to Africa," Jean-Luc said. "What's it like there? What brought you to France?" By the end of the ride, Jean-Luc had learned about his passengers' studies in engineering, his family's farm near Dakar, his dreams of building bridges between continents. Instead of a silent transaction, they had shared a moment of human connection. "That story about the president on the airplane," Jean-Luc said as they reached their destination. "It made me think about how I interact with people. Made me realize I've been missing out on a lot of interesting conversations." The young engineer smiled. "It made me think, too, about dignity and how we carry ourselves in the world." International leaders began referencing the Flight 227 incident in speeches about human rights and dignity. President Emmanuel Macron of France issued a statement. "The treatment of President Traoré was unacceptable and does not represent French values. We must all examine our own actions and attitudes to ensure that such incidents never happen again." The African Union called an extraordinary session to discuss the incident and its broader implications. Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, the former chairperson of the African Union Commission, addressed the assembly. "What happened to President Traoré happens to Africans around the world every day. The difference is that his experience was recorded and witnessed. We must ask ourselves, how many other incidents of discrimination and disrespect occur that we never hear about?" In the United States, civil rights leaders connected the story to ongoing struggles with racial justice. Reverend Jesse Jackson issued a statement. "President Traoré's dignified response reminds us that the struggle for human dignity is universal. Whether on an airplane or in any other setting, every person deserves to be treated with respect regardless of their race, nationality, or economic status." The story reached unexpected corners of the globe. In a small village in rural China, a teacher showed her students the news coverage and asked them to discuss what they had learned. In a corporate training session in Tokyo, employees watched the video and examined their own customer service practices. In a community center in São Paulo, Brazil, activists used the story to talk about prejudice in their own society. 3 months after the flight, Clara Dubois was working at a homeless shelter in Paris, serving meals to people whose society had forgotten. She had lost her job, her savings were dwindling, but she had found something unexpected, a sense of purpose she had never experienced in her years of airline service. The work was hard and often thankless. The people she served came from many backgrounds: French citizens who had lost their homes, immigrants seeking asylum, veterans struggling with trauma, young people aged out of foster care. Many were African, from countries she had only known as destinations on departure boards. One day, an elderly Burkinabe man named Ousmane arrived at the shelter. He had lived in Paris for 30 years, working construction until an injury left him unable to continue. When Clara served him soup, he looked at her carefully. "You look familiar," he said in accented French. Clara's heart stopped. Had he recognized her from the news coverage? Was she about to face the anger and judgment she deserved? "You are the woman from the airplane," Ousmane said quietly. Clara nodded, unable to speak. Ousmane was silent for a long moment, studying her face. Then he said, "You are here now. That says something." "I'm trying to understand," Clara whispered. "I'm trying to become better." Ousmane smiled gently. "Understanding is a journey, not a destination. The fact that you are on the journey matters." Over the following weeks, Ousmane became an unexpected teacher. He told Clara stories about his homeland, about the challenges and beauty of Burkina Faso, about the dignity and resilience of his people. He helped her understand that the man she had mistreated on the airplane was not just a president, but a representative of millions of Africans who carried similar dignity and deserved similar respect. President Traoré, Ousmane explained one day as they cleaned dishes together, comes from our tradition of leadership through service. In our culture, the greatest leaders are those who make themselves small so that others can be large. You saw this on your airplane, but you did not recognize it. Clara began to understand that her journey toward redemption would require more than apologies or volunteer work. It would require a fundamental transformation of how she saw the world and her place in it. She started reading books about African history, about colonialism and its lasting effects, about the experiences of immigrants in France. She began to understand that her prejudice was not just personal failing, but part of larger systems of discrimination that she had unknowingly supported throughout her life. 6 months after the flight, Clara finally gathered the courage to send her letter to President Traoré. She had rewritten it dozens of times, each version attempting to capture the depth of her understanding and regret. The final version was simpler than the first, more honest, more vulnerable, more real. She sent it through diplomatic channels, not knowing if it would ever reach him, but hoping that somehow her words might contribute to healing rather than harm. The letter arrived at the presidential palace in Ouagadougou on a Tuesday morning, mixed in with hundreds of other pieces of correspondence from around the world. President Traoré's staff had been filtering communications related to the airplane incident for months, but something about the simple handwriting on this envelope caught the attention of his personal secretary. I read Clara's letter in my private office, with morning light streaming through windows that looked out onto gardens where my predecessors had made decisions that shaped our nation's destiny. Her words were raw with honesty, free of the justifications and excuses that had characterized many of the apologies I had received. I read it twice, then set it aside and walked to the window. In the garden below, workers were tending to plants that Thomas Sankara had ordered planted decades earlier. Some of those plants had died and been replaced. Others had grown strong despite drought and neglect. All had been shaped by their environment while maintaining their essential nature. Clara's letter reminded me that people, like plants, could change and grow. The woman who had treated me with such hostility was beginning a process of transformation that might lead her to become someone entirely different. The question was whether society would give her the space to grow or whether it would forever define her by her worst moment. I called my secretary and dictated a brief response. Dear Ms. Dubois, your letter reached me, and I have read it with care. Growth requires courage, the courage to acknowledge our failures and the courage to change. You are demonstrating both. The incident on the airplane was painful, but it has become a catalyst for important conversations about dignity and respect around the world. If your own journey of understanding contributes to that larger conversation, then something positive will have emerged from something negative. I wish you well in your continued growth. Ibrahim Traoré. 2 years after Flight 227, the story had become part of business school curricula, diplomatic training programs, and human rights education around the world. The Traoré principle, treating every person with dignity regardless of their apparent status, was taught in customer service programs across multiple industries. Air France had implemented comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all employees, not just as a response to the incident, but as recognition that the problem was systemic rather than individual. Other airlines followed suit, understanding that in an interconnected world, how they treated passengers reflected not just their corporate values, but their understanding of human dignity. Clara had completed her volunteer work at the shelter and enrolled in a university program in social work, focusing on immigrant services. She still received occasional messages from people who recognized her from the viral videos, some supportive of her apparent transformation, others unforgiving of her original behavior. She had learned to accept both responses as part of her continuing journey. In a speech to the United Nations General Assembly, I reflected on how the airplane incident had become something larger than any of us had anticipated. 2 years ago, I boarded an airplane as a passenger and experienced discrimination that millions of people face every day. The only difference was that my experience was recorded and witnessed by the world. This visibility created an opportunity for global reflection on how we treat each other. But the real lesson of that flight was not about individual prejudice. It was about our collective responsibility to create a world where dignity is not dependent on recognition, where respect is not reserved for the powerful, where humanity is acknowledged in every human being. The flight attendant who treated me poorly has since begun a journey of growth and understanding. I share this not to excuse her behavior, but to illustrate that people can change, that hearts can be opened, that minds can be transformed. If we believe in the possibility of change for individuals, we must also believe in the possibility of change for societies, for nations, for our world. The question is not whether discrimination exists. We know it does. The question is what we will do about it. Will we remain silent when we witness injustice? Will we examine our own biases and prejudices? Will we work to create systems and cultures that protect the dignity of every person? The airplane was a small space, but the lesson it taught was enormous. We are all passengers on this earth together, and how we treat each other during the journey determines the kind of world we create and leave behind. Today, the story of Flight 227 continues to resonate around the world. It appears in textbooks and training materials, in sermons and speeches, in conversations between parents and children about how to treat others. The hashtag #Seat2A has become a symbol of dignity in the face of discrimination, a reminder that how we respond to injustice defines who we are. Clara Dubois now works as a counselor for refugee families in Paris, helping people navigate systems that can be unwelcoming and bureaucracies that can be hostile. Her colleagues don't all know about her past, but those who do say that her understanding of what it feels like to be judged and rejected makes her particularly effective at helping others who face similar challenges. She keeps a photo on her desk, not of herself, but of President Traoré speaking at the United Nations. Below it, she has written a quote from his speech: "Dignity is not dependent on recognition." The lessons of Flight 227 were not simple ones. They couldn't be reduced to slogans or sound bites, couldn't be solved by policy changes or training programs alone. They required the kind of deep, ongoing work that societies must do to confront their own prejudices and create cultures of genuine respect and inclusion. But perhaps that was the most important lesson of all. That change is possible. That growth can emerge from failure. That dignity can be maintained even in the face of hatred, and that forgiveness can open doors to transformation that punishment alone never could. The flight lasted 5.5 hours, but its impact continues. To this day, carrying forward a message about the kind of world we can create when we choose to see the humanity in every person we encounter. In Seat 2A, I learned something about the power of quiet dignity. In her cabin, Clara learned something about the poison of prejudice and the possibility of redemption. And around the world, millions of people learned that true respect doesn't depend on titles or positions. It depends on our recognition that every human being carries within themselves a spark of infinite worth. That lesson continues to travel, from heart to heart, from generation to generation, carrying forward the hope that one day no one will have to endure what happened on Flight 227, because we will have built a world where dignity is the birthright of every person, and respect is the gift we give freely to all. The journey toward that world is long and difficult, but it begins with individual choices, the choice to see rather than to judge, to understand rather than to condemn, to build bridges rather than walls. It begins with remembering that we are all passengers together on this earth, and how we treat each other during the journey determines not just the quality of the flight, but the destination we reach together. The story of Flight 227 reminds us that every interaction is an opportunity to choose dignity over prejudice, understanding over hatred, growth over stagnation. It reminds us that true power lies not in our ability to diminish others, but in our capacity to recognize and honor the humanity that exists in every person we meet. And it reminds us that sometimes the most important lessons come not from moments of triumph, but from moments when our humanity is tested, and we choose to respond with grace, dignity, and hope for a better tomorrow.